My name is Brogain and welcome to .NET Mastery, the ultimate learning resource for .NET developers. In this video, we will take a look at how to implement localization and globalization in Blazor WebAssembly project. Whatever we implement in the WebAssembly project can also be implemented using Blazor server application. Globalization, often referred to as internationalization, is the process of making a product or content multilingual. A globalized product or website should support multiple languages. Localization, on the other hand, is the process of translating content to fit the demands of one locale, which means based on the locale of your website, your content should adapt to that language. In other words, localization is the process of setting up the content for local geography, which is a continuation process of globalization. .NET Blazor provides mechanism for adding local culture info in the middleware. Before we get into how it's being done, let's take a look at what we will be building. This is the final demo of the application that we will build. You can see we'll be adding a drop-down here which will have different cultures. If US is selected, the first two lines here will be displayed in English, but if we change that to Spanish, the page reloads and the data changes. This is a pretty basic application, but our focus is how to implement this in Blazor WebAssembly project. So let's get started with all of this from the next video. First thing that we have to do is we need to create a new project, and I'm using Visual Studio 2019. I will start with a fresh Blazor application to learn localization in Blazor. I will call the project name as Localization in Blazor, and let's create this. Localization works in both server application as well as WebAssembly. We'll implement that inside the Blazor WebAssembly project. Now first you need to think about what are the things that we want to localize in our application. So for that, let me first run the application, and on the landing page we have Hello World and Welcome to our new app. Let's localize both of these terms. How do we do that? We will first have to install the package for localization. So inside Tools, NuGet Package Manager, we will have to look for a package inside the Browse tab, which will be Microsoft.extensions.localization. Let's install that package. And once we do that, let's close the NuGet Package Manager and the landing page. Let's save everything. There we go. Next thing that we have to do is we need to add the terminology or the resource file. So inside the shared folder, let me create a new folder. I will call this as resource files. In there we'll have to click add new item and we'll search for resource file. Now the resource.resx will be the basic version or the default English version. Inside the resource file, what we have to do is we need to give it a name and value. Give it a name of Hello World here, and we'll have the welcome text. So in English, we want to display Hello World, and then welcome message, we can say welcome to our app. So this is the default language that we want to display. Let's save that, and let's add another resource file for Spanish. So new item, we have the resource file. Rather than resource1, we will call this resource.es, which is the notation for Spanish, and let's add that. Here you need the two keys. First one will be Hello World, and the next one will be welcome. This will match what we have inside the resource.resx. Then we need value here, which will be Spanish translation of these two lines right here. So let's add that. We'll paste the one for hello world and then for the welcome as well. Once you make all of these changes, you will have to save both of the locale. We do not need string. Perfect, looks good. Now one thing here is very important. The access modifier, you will have to make them as public. If you don't do that, then this will not work. We have created the project, we added the resource file for the two keys that we have. Let's continue in the next video. So now we have the key value pairs in both of these files, and we also have the public access modifier. With that, let me close them and let's open up the index page, which is inside the pages folder. Right here, we have hello world and welcome to your new app. In order to use the package, you will have to add using statements right here, or we can add that in global location, which is inside underscore imports.razor. Here we need to add two using statements. First for the resource file, and the next one is for the localization package that we added. So we'll add the using statement. Our application name is localization in Blazor. In there we have the shared folder, and in there we have resource file. For the localization, we'll add microsoft.extensions.localization. Once we add that, we still need to configure program.cs to add localization in our application. So for that, on the builder object, we will be adding services.add localization. So this looks great, but how about we test that with our index page? In order to do that, we just need to add localization rather than using the static words that we have. So here in the main page, we will have to add the localization using inject attribute. So inside the index page, we will have to inject localization. Make sure to save the underscore imports. That way you can access or inject the string localizer, and this will be on resource. This resource is the class file. If you see, that is inside the resource.resx, we have the designer and we have the resource right here. So that is what it is accessing. Because of that, we had to add the using statement. Then what we will do is we'll call this as localizer. We already have the key value pairs that we added. So here we will use localizer and we need to pass the key name. If we go to our resource file, the key name is hello world and next one is welcome. Let me paste that here and I'll do the same for welcome as well. Perfect. So with this, let's run our application. Now you will notice that we are not using the static strings that we had inside the index page. But still, when we run the application, we have hello world and welcome to our app. You can see these are slightly different than what we had before, and that is because this will now match what we have inside the value inside our default resource.resx, which is for English. Now what if we want to see if the Spanish version is working or not? We'll have to go to the settings. I'm using Internet Edge, but you can do this in any browser. So here you just need to search for language preferences. You'll have to add a language, which is Spanish. Add that, and you'll have to toggle it to the top. Perfect. Once you do this, if you go back and if you refresh, great, you can see our Spanish words are coming in and everything is looking great. So with this, you can see that based on the language of your browser, you can see localization is working. Let's switch back, or rather remove Spanish right now. Let me just move it down, or rather remove it. Let's close this and refresh, and we'll be back to English. So with this, we have seen localization in action. But in a real-world application, you will have a drop-down where you can select or toggle between the language. Let's continue with that. in the next video. Now what we want to do is we want to add a drop down here which will have all of the languages that we want, and we'll be storing the selected language inside the local storage for Blazor. So first we need to add the local storage. So we'll go to the package manager. Let me open up solution here. You can use any local storage. What I will do is I will use the blazor.local storage. We'll add that in our project. And then we can add a using statement inside the imports.razor for blazor.local storage. Let me also open up our startup, or rather program.cs, and here we will be adding the services for add Blazor local storage, and we'll add the using statement. Let's save everything, and we have configured local storage in our project. Now let's create a new component inside shared for our dropdown. We will call this as culture dropdown. Here we will be using the culture info, so we'll have to use the using statement for system.globalization. Rather than h3, let me add a strong and display culture. Then we need a dropdown, so we will add a select tag with class of form control, and we will bind that to a variable. This variable will be of the type culture info, and we'll create that in just a moment. Let me give it some style for width as well as margin. Before we do more things with the select tag, let me create the culture info list. So culture info, it will be an array. Let's call this as cultures is equal to new. So we'll add a new culture info for ENUS. And we'll add a new culture info for Spanish. So ES. This looks good for the dropdown that we need to populate. Now the culture that is selected will be just one. That will be culture info. And let me call this culture. We will have to create getter and setter. So when we do a get, we will say culture info. There is a current culture inside the culture info, which defines that what is the current culture set for the project. We haven't set that yet, but we will be setting that in the upcoming video. Right now, we will retrieve the current culture and we will assign that. Then when we have to set anything, this will be a little more complicated. We'll say culture info dot current culture if that is not equal to the value. This means that we have to set a new culture from the dropdown that user selects. At that time, rather than setting the culture here, we will be creating an extension method for that. But in order to get what the user selected from dropdown, we will be storing everything inside local storage. So on top here, we will inject local storage service. Let me call this as local storage. So if the current culture is not equal to value, we will set whatever the value is inside a local storage. So set item async, this will be of type string. We have to give it a key and a value. So the key, let me call this culture, and value is inside value.name. Now what happens is when you set the culture, we need to reload the page. Now when you set a new culture, we have to force reload. So for that, we can add navigation manager using dependency here. So we will inject that, and we can use our nav manager.navigate to. We'll navigate to the same URL that we have, which is navmanager.uri, but we'll say force load to be true. That will reload the page, and the new culture will take place, and it will change the data if that is available. With that, we need to bind here, and we'll bind our culture. And inside the dropdown, we need to select all the options for user to select. So we'll have a for each. We'll say variable culture in cultures, that is the array, and in here we'll select the option, give it a value of culture, and we'll display culture dot display name. Perfect, all the errors went away. Now where will we consume this component? We will be doing that inside the main layout where we have the nav menu and the about link. We don't care about the about link, so right here let me add the culture dropdown. Let's run the application and see how this looks. So right now if we go on the dropdown, we have US as well as Spanish. If you select, nothing will happen. It will just reload the page, but the culture will not change because we haven't set the current culture to whatever is selected from the dropdown. Let's do that in the next video. Now if you take a look at what we are doing inside the culture dropdown is we are using the current culture. But if a dropdown change, we are assigning that in local storage. So we need some kind of logic that will extract the culture from local storage and assign that to the current culture. We will do that in an extension method. So we'll create a new folder for that to keep things organized. And we'll call this as extensions. In there, let's add a new class file. We will give this a meaningful name, which is WebAssembly host extension. Here we will have to make this a static class, and we'll have to add a method here, which will be public async static task, and we'll call this as set default culture. Now since this is a static class and we want to call that inside the program.cs, the first type here will be the WebAssembly host. So we'll add that WebAssembly host. We'll do control dot, add the using statement. Let's call this as host. This is the basics about extension method, that the first type will be the same on which we are performing or calling this particular method. What do we want in this case? We want to extract the value from local storage and assign that to our culture. We cannot directly inject local storage here because it is an extension method, but we can use host here to fetch the local storage. So we'll say variable local storage is equal to host.services. We have the get required service in there. We'll do control dot to add the dependency injection statement, and we need to type here what service we are looking for. We are looking for local storage service. We'll have to do control dot for Blazor dot local storage. Once we have the local storage, then we need to retrieve the culture inside that local storage. So we'll say variable culture from local storage is equal to await local storage dot get item async. The type here is string, and what is the key name that we gave? That is culture. We have the value that user selected from dropdown. Then we need to assign that to a culture info. So we'll add the using statement for globalization. Let me call this as culture. Now if culture from local storage is not null, then we want to create a new culture with that particular name. So we'll say culture is equal to new culture info, and we have culture from local storage. If that is null, that means the application is just getting loaded and we want to set the default culture that we want. And that will be ENUS. Once we have set the culture inside the culture info object, we just need to assign the current culture. So we'll say culture info dot default thread current culture will be culture. We'll copy this, paste it one more time for default thread current UI culture. So with this, our extension method looks good. But where will we call this? We will call that inside program.cs. Right here, we have builder.build and run async. We will split this in multiple lines. Let's remove the run async right now. And the builder.build, let me add that in a variable host. And then you can notice that the host variable that we have is of type WebAssembly host. If we go to our extension, you can see right here we have this extension method on the same WebAssembly host. Because of that, we should be able to access that extension method. All we have to do is let me add a using statement for our project name, localization in Blazor.extensions. So right here we'll say await host dot we have the set default culture. Once we set the default culture, we need to call the run async. So we'll say await host dot we have run async. With this, the flow looks great. Let me add a semicolon here. Now once you make all of this change, you will have to make one change inside the project file for everything to work. So we'll select edit project file, and where you have the target framework, with Blazor, when you are dynamically changing the application culture, you will have to set the Blazor WebAssembly load all globalization data to be true. If you don't do this, you will run into an error message when you run the application. With that change, let's run our application and see everything in action. So right here, we have the cultures. If we change this to Spanish, the page reloads, but it again sets the default to US. Something is not right here. So let's go back, and this time let's go to solution to our culture dropdown. Whoops, right here, we forgot the @ sign, so we were just assigning a value of a string culture. It should actually be the culture object that we have right here. So with that, let's run the application, and I believe everything is looking good. We don't have any default culture. Let's select US, and that looks good. And then if we change it to Spanish, we can see that the text is also changing. So with this, our localization is working as expected with Blazor application, and dropdown is binded as well. So with that, localization comes to an end in Blazor. But when it comes to Blazor or .NET, there is so much more. If you want to enroll in the complete Blazor course or learn more concepts about .NET, head on to .NETmastery.com and you can explore all of the courses. That being said, that's all we had with globalization and localization in Blazor. So good luck and happy coding!